Hello and welcome to the SIWI Sofa, a new feature at this year's World Water Week. We're sitting down with some of the most interesting participants to take a closer look at the key water-related issues being discussed this week in Stockholm. We'd love to hear what you think of this new format and the discussions taking place here, so please reach out to us on social media using the hashtag SIWI Sofa. My name is Eric Paglia, and the name of this session is How Can We Solve the Competition for Fresh Water? This is part 2 of a session convened by the Rockefeller Foundation to discuss their freshwater competition initiative in development. This session builds on part 1 and continues to explore the hypothesis that water competition can be harnessed to create incentives for positive change. Today we speak with 3 additional participants to learn about their perspectives and experiences in utilizing the tools and mechanisms developed under the initiative. And joining me here today, we have Brian Richter, the Chief Scientist of the Global Freshwater Program at the Nature Conservancy. Mark Smith, Director of the Global Water Program at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And Casey Brown, Associate Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Massachusetts. Welcome to the SIWI Sofa.
Thank you.
And Casey, perhaps we'll start with you and to give us a bit of a big picture overview of this initiative and some of the tools and mechanisms and principles that are common to all the different projects. Your expertise is in water resource engineering, and you serve as technical advisor to the Rockefeller Foundation for this initiative. So what do we need, or why do we need incentive-based mechanisms for water?
Eric, it's a fair question. I think if we take a step back and look around the world, look to where our decisions are leading us right now when it comes to water, it's not a pretty picture. We look at the decisions we're making leading to rivers drying before they reach the sea, seas disappearing. In some cases, we've created seas in places where they weren't there before. We know that we need to change the way that we make decisions right now. And the key is, I think, the word that you used. You said harnessing competition. Competition is a good thing. Competition leads to innovation. It leads to investment. Competition leads to really efficiency. And the idea behind these incentive-based mechanisms is that the incentives are out there. The incentives to do better are certainly out there. We know the World Economic Forum has identified water and water-related hazards as one of the key business risks that they face. So why aren't they taking action? This is the challenge. And I think that these instruments and these mechanisms that we're talking about are trying to unleash the incentives that are there and let those incentives, instead of being masked, start to really play a role in the decisions that are being made. And the idea is we'll just do a much better job in terms of managing water. We have to face the real consequences and really understand the value and the implications of our choices that we make in terms of water management.
Brian, perhaps you could give us some examples of how these tools and mechanisms are used in the projects that you're involved with.
Sure. Well, really at the root of this issue that we're all working on in this project is the fact that in about a third of the world's river basins and aquifers, the water's being so heavily used that it's essentially being used up, as Casey alluded to. And unfortunately, it's being all used up, and there was nothing left in reserve to support the natural ecosystems, the freshwater ecosystems, the rivers, the lakes, the wetlands. And also, another constituency, if you will, that was left out of that, the water allocation, is a lot of underserved communities, indigenous peoples and other folks who didn't necessarily know how to get in line for water when the water was being formally issued among the different parties of water users. And so one of the challenges that we're working on is how can you free up some water in these systems that are where water is being so highly competed for? How can you free up some water and get it reallocated to these couple of concerns that have been left out, up until this point? So again, freshwater ecosystems and underserved communities. So fortunately, the Rockefeller Foundation's program really challenged us to think as creatively as we could about what are the incentives that can be used to finance, to mobilize that shift in allocation of water.
What would an example of an incentive be?
Well, it's one of the areas that we're working on is it's clear that there are a lot of individuals in the world who share this concern, who are aware of this concern. They see that the freshwater ecosystems are being dried up. They want to get some water to these underserved communities. And among those people with concern is a good portion of the investment community. And so there is a class of investors in particular that our organization has been focusing on that we call impact investors. They have the funds available. They want to invest in trying to resolve this problem. They're willing to take a more modest return on their money if we can show that it's going to environmental and social good. And so we're trying to figure out how can we create an investable program where those investors can put their money into it, can enable us to do the work that we're trying to do. And of course, the key part of solving that equation is, can we somehow also find a way to generate some revenue that can go back to the investors to give them that modest return?
Mark, perhaps you can give us some examples on how your organization works under this initiative.
Sure. I think just building on what Brian said, if we're looking at competition for water, the fundamental thing that has to happen is for water to be allocated. For stakeholders, water users in a basin, to, including nature, to, by some mechanism, decide this amount of water goes here, this amount of water goes here, this amount of water goes here. And in the world of water and in places like Stockholm Water Week, that's a fundamental issue that everyone's trying to address through different means, whether it's through changes in regulation, whether it's through governance mechanisms, including negative incentives. So if you don't play by the rules and use only the water that's allocated to you, you're going to get a fine. Or you can allocate it through markets and trading, and that's part of what the Rockefeller initiative has been looking at. But for IUCN, my organization, we've been working in looking at the ideas for Tanzania. So Tanzania is a place where there's not enough data to know more precisely how should you allocate water to different uses, to support different water users to make those decisions very robustly. There's good regulation, but perhaps it's not as comprehensively applied as you would wish in order to be able to make those kinds of allocations. So we've said, in an environment like that, how can you have improved mechanisms, better mechanisms of bringing people together to make those decisions around allocation, to make a deal about how do you allocate water between users in a way that helps, we hope, everybody to have their share, meet their needs, including natural ecosystems. But do so in a way that's not about the negative incentives. That's not about, hey, if you don't play the game, you're going to get fined. But rather to say, hey, if there's investment on the table and you want access to that investment, then you need a water permit. So then it's a positive incentive. So then you move from stakeholder apathy to stakeholder enthusiasm. And by doing that, maybe we lower everybody's water risk so that investors can come in to support farming, to support different kinds of development. So then everybody gains. So the fundamental issue, though, is how do you make the deal? How do you make a deal so that we know how water is allocated? And then hopefully everybody's better off.
So these tools and mechanisms, they have to be tailored to the different contexts they're applied in, whether it's the Western United States or Tanzania. What sort of barriers do you typically encounter? Cultural, geographical, political? Do these present problems?
Huge problems, right? That's why these things aren't fixed, because we're dealing with a complicated set of issues, and we're dealing with a whole wide variety of stakeholders who have a wide variety of interests, a wide variety of understanding. So if you didn't have all these sorts of factors coming in, then we could fix all this. You just say, yeah, you get this much water, you get this much water, done. Yeah. But it just doesn't work like that in the real world.
Yeah, and as Mark is saying, Eric, it's a combination of both setting the rules, being clear about who gets to use the water and how much water, maybe perhaps when and for what purpose. But then it also requires the governance system, the capacity, the expertise to be able to hold people to the rules, to be able to make smart decisions about how much water you should leave for the environmental purposes. And a universal problem is that governance tends to not be adequately strong in too many places in the world. And so, so you have people who are taking advantage of those shortcomings. You have people who are coming in and perhaps acquiring rights to use water or using water in ways that may be very profitable for them. but it may not be in the greater interest of the greater good, and it may not be equitably shared. And there will be parties who get left out of the opportunity that way. So our organizations work very hard on trying to strengthen that capacity as well.
And so part of the advantage then of working on incentives is that can bring people into alignment. So they say, yes, we're all better off if we can make the rules work for everybody. Yeah.
And that's an important point, because it's not just, we think of incentives and there are financial incentives, certainly. But what's been really interesting about this is seeing the incentives for better regulation. That if you're an investor of any kind, at the farm scale, or you're a corporate investor, you want to know that if you make an investment, there's going to be water there that you can use so that investment will pay off. And how will you have that certainty if there's not some sort of regulation that says this is the amount of water you can have, and you can have that? There's some reliability associated with that. And also, maybe there's a mechanism by which you can get more water when you need it. And so what's really interesting to think about this is not only mechanisms or incentives for a particular deal, and much of this is about just making deals,
right,
but also the incentives that it creates for better regulation. Because that's what investors want. They want that kind of certainty. And I think they're willing to pay for it. And in the case where it does result in higher cost water, it's well worth it to have that kind of certainty.
Right. And a really key aspect of this too is, and a really important point to make, is that we're not trying to substitute or supplant formal governments. The governments want to do these things better. They need help doing it. There's various reasons why they can't. Again, they don't have the capacity or the expertise. They may not have the resources. And so what we have to figure out is what can we do in the way of incentives to perhaps bring some additional resources so that we can be catalytic, that those interventions are positive, working in the public interest, working for the public good, and helping as many people out as we possibly can, but doing it in full cooperation and collaboration with government, and hopefully looking toward how do you build that capacity and that capability in the government over longer periods of time, because we don't want to be interveners, forever.
Yeah. For me, one of the related issues is acceleration, right? There are good governance frameworks. Tanzania, where we're working, has an excellent framework for governance, and the agencies that work on that are working really hard. And whether it's the donor community putting money into that, or whether it's the basin agencies in Tanzania, they're working hard on getting it rolled out. But it doesn't go fast enough. And yes, it doesn't go fast enough in terms of having good regulation, but also solving the problems quickly enough for good economic development, for good conservation of ecosystems, for whatever. Solving it fast enough. So part of what the thinking that's gone into the work we've been doing under this program is to say, well, if we had platforms in which there were incentives, there were investment pipelines available to incentivize people to be involved more proactively in water management, can you do that in ways that accelerate the system?
Yes.
And so that the management of the resource can catch up with the constraints that it's facing.
Right.
Otherwise, development will be undercut. Otherwise, biodiversity will be lost.
Yeah, it's a really key point. Mark's emphasis on the urgency. We need to speed it up because bad things are happening, and they're going to get worse in a hurry because of numerous influences. But it was really the last couple of decades where you finally saw the level of water use in a lot of these places get to the point where it was intersecting with the limits of water availability. And so all of a sudden you had people realizing that this wasn't, a boundless frontier, an endless opportunity, that in fact there were limits, there were constraints. And so now that we realize that we're up against that, and up against that in so many places, that's why Mark is saying the acceleration, because we've got to find some solutions and get them into play as quickly as possible, because people's lives are being damaged, people are dying from lack of access to water. The economies, your point earlier about the World Economic Forum is elevating this to the top of its list of global risks to the economy. So there's a lot of potential damage here, and so we're working quite earnestly and hard on trying to come up with some ways to intervene.
Mm-hmm. Who do you generally partner with? I mean, you mentioned governments. You're also working with private sector actors, civil society.
Altogether, and that's part of. Yeah. There's a strong movement to do that around water resources, anyways. But certainly, that's a fundamental pillar of the Rockefeller Initiative: is how can we bring these groups together in order to have the collaborations, the cooperation, maybe that's a better word, the cooperation that's needed to solve problems.
Yeah. And we've long had good collaboration in the non-governmental organizations community. Mark and I have been, in the leadership of our respective organizations on freshwater for a couple of decades now, and looking for opportunities to help. But I think what we see now is that we're really coming to grips with how do you seize the potential of the private sector and channel that into bringing their resources into helping out here. And so that's a really intriguing part of this program.
Which is where risk
That's
comes
right.
up.
Yeah, I was going to say that the private sector is so important, and I think we're really in a transformative period right now, where, just as Brian was saying, we are starting to see essentially the marginal value of water is no longer zero. For a long time, we could just take as much as we wanted and use it for whatever we wanted, and we have built up over the last 30 to 40 years amazing technologies to extract water from these systems. What we have not built up is any kind of a governance system to manage that competition. Yes. And so as a result, we're really undergoing a water grab throughout the world. And it's the private sector, to some extent, who's out ahead,
yes,
and in many cases, looking around the world for where that water is freely available. I think it's an opportunity also to provide the governance such that, and to provide value in governance, in the sense that, yes, you can take that water for a short term, but we all know about bubbles bursting. We all know about going into debts. We're essentially going into an environmental debt, a water debt right now, through groundwater, extracting too much groundwater, through killing, I think is maybe not too strong a word, aquatic ecosystems around the world. Right. And so this is a short-term strategy. And the private sector can see that. They're long-term planners. And so I think if we could bring them on board and create their interest, or really create their understanding, or hopefully build some sort of true value in how regulation can act, and they'll be on board with us, and it'll be amazing, I think, what can happen.
And I'll just add, while safeguarding the interests of local communities, poor and vulnerable people, natural ecosystems, and that's fundamental to the interests of all our organizations and also the Rockefeller Initiative. How do we get that package, a package that'll work in the particular context? As you said, it's different in different places. There's no recipe, but that's going to make sure that people's interests and needs are safeguarded.
And there's another element to this, which is that the private sector, you both have touched on risk, and that they're seeing that their assets, their supply chains, the resources that they rely upon are now at risk because of this water conflict, competition. And so it's been remarkable, actually, I think, for all of us to witness in the last 10 to 15 years, the rapidly growing number of companies that are finally becoming aware of this first, and then many of them reaching out to the non-governmental organizations like ours and asking for help. Both educate me on what the problem is, but most importantly, of course, what potential solutions might there be? How can I better protect my interests? How can I better protect my company? Because they've really come to appreciate what they're up against. And so it is a very opportune time. In crisis is opportunity here, I think. So.
I'm also wondering how you work, or perhaps you don't collaborate, but you're obviously learning from each other's experiences in different contexts. Could you say a few words about that? Obviously, you two know each other quite well and familiar with each other's work. But with the other partner organizations under this Rockefeller Initiative, Rockefeller Foundation Initiative, I should say, as well as with perhaps the work of Casey as a technical advisor, so maybe the central level as well. Yeah,
if I can just start on that, because this is really my favorite part of this job, is that we bring in the world's best environmental organizations, give them a super challenging problem to try and say solve it in 3 months, and they've all really risen to the challenge. And what's really neat is how it all fits together. We're working in places where water markets are well developed, and we're going to make them work better for ecosystems. We're working in a place where it's just not there. There aren't water rights being allocated in a meaningful way yet, and yet in every place there is this difference in terms of the value of water, and thus the incentives for some sort of transactions. We're just making deals, and we're just trying to unlock those in each of these different places. And so for me, I sit back and I just listen to these guys. They're such experts, and get very excited about what we can do going forward.
Well, for me personally, in working in this arena, but also in terms of what has to happen to really solve water problems, collaboration and cooperation are key. And we see that in the initiative, the spirit of collaboration, but that's where the rewards come from, that's where the breakthroughs come from. Water is a complex issue. It's a simple substance, which means that people don't tend to think about it enough, but it's a complex issue. And so no one person, no one set of brain power tends to be enough to solve it. So collaboration is really key.
Right. Yeah. Yes, exactly. The nature of the problem and the challenge requires highly interdisciplinary solutions. And essentially no organization or agency has all of that in one place. And so in the water world, we've learned to partner, to share, to figure out how you can work together to bring the key disciplines together. And so the exciting thing about each of these projects is some of them are really strong in the technological advancements in development, using computer systems and as a way of helping to facilitate trade and being aware of people who are interested in trading. You have some of the organizations that are working on with the corporate sector and their concerns about access to their agricultural ingredients that go into the products that they make. There's huge policy components in this, and there's science, of course, underlying all of it. The environmental sciences, the physical sciences, and the social sciences. And so this is just yet another opportunity, and with the support of the Rockefeller Foundation, providing some funding support to enable us to have this kind of a collaboration and throwing it into the mixing bowl here and seeing what we can come up with, not just individually but also together. So that's been a really rewarding experience. Very, very interesting.
From what I understand, this freshwater competition initiative is in a relatively early stage. How do you see the evolution of this initiative taking place in terms of refining some of these tools and mechanisms and also some of these projects on the ground around the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that we see huge potential in all of these ideas, and what we really need are demonstrations. I think there's wonderful economic theory that this is could be an effective approach for solving some of these water competition issues and some of the problems we see around the world. What we really need to see is that it can work on the ground, that when we go into individual places, we really see some results, and we can demonstrate all the things we're talking about, that you can have an incentive-based mechanism, that it can get water to higher value uses, that it doesn't cause harm to the poor and the vulnerable who might not be in the best position to compete economically, financially for water, and that it actually does benefit ecosystems, which is fundamentally what this is about, that we want to preserve water for ecosystems. We think the best way to do that is to get water used more efficiently, create incentives for investing in efficiency, and we think incentives, economic incentives, are what drives that.
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that the task that Rockefeller, or the space that Rockefeller created for us, was really adventurous. It was adventurous, I think, in terms of perhaps they didn't quite know where we'd get to,
or what they'd get,
and they gave us the opportunity to give them proposals for things that we didn't really know the answers to, which isn't so usual in our business, right? We tend to need. We're working with donors and funders who want to be pretty convinced that at the end of their support, you will have achieved a set of outcomes. And here's a process that said, give us your best ideas, and we'll support you to try and think them through further. So surely, therefore, and that's been tremendous. But yes, therefore, at the end of this process, we will still have prototypes, concepts that now have more analysis attached to them, that now have feedback and critique from a range of stakeholders, and so they've been shaped into something that we hope will be workable. But then there will be a lot more work to do in terms of further analysis, in terms of how does it fit within the political context of the places that you're working. What will be the reactions of some groups that might be really opposed to bringing private sector investment into these kinds of environments. We will need to do a lot of demonstrating, small scale, larger scale, and then learning. And then learning with those stakeholders. And I just wanted to make one point, was throughout this whole process, my favorite moment was probably in a set of focus groups that we ran with stakeholders in Tanzania to look at the idea of if we put investment packages on the table that brought together impact investors and private sector investment related to reducing water risk. What we were asking them, what would you think of that? What would you do? And I was very nervous as we started these sessions that I was going to spend half the day explaining how this would work. And it wasn't the case at all. People got it like that. So there's hopefully therefore, in terms of moving this forward, there is hopefully therefore a lot of people have the instinctual way to work with investment in markets and making deals, and that I still think means that there's a lot of potential for this to get us somewhere new and different and faster, even in environments which are not so well regulated, which are not so perhaps seen as ready for this, but maybe people will surprise us. Yeah.
And as you would expect in any research and development incubator, things are going to move in surprising ways, and some ideas and some parts of ideas are going to move faster than others. Yes. I think we're all anxious to see some of these get out in the playing field, get out in the real world and see whether or not they work. But another one of the wonderful aspects of this program has been coming from the foundation, a strong emphasis on what the foundation refers to as stress testing with stakeholders. And what that means is, just as Mark just described, is taking your idea out into the people that would be involved in the implementation or affected by the implementation and saying, what do you think? And getting that feedback. And so it's not necessarily something that all organizations think about doing a priori, is to go out and ask everybody, people that you don't know, people that, these might be somewhat sensitive issues. But being provoked to go through that process has been really a powerful aspect of the learning process.
I suppose the results of this program are meant to eventually be transferred beyond the current boundaries of this Rockefeller Foundation initiative.
Yes.
That's exactly right. It's a challenging aspect of it as well, because of the context is so important, as we know with all water issues. An economist will tell you if a market should exist, it will exist. That it'll create itself. And so that's kind of the challenge that we're up against. But at the same time, Brian talks about 20% increase in efficiency in irrigated agriculture, and we've got the problem licked to some extent. Yeah. And we heard a number yesterday. The value of water for public water supply is about $2,000 per cubic meter, and it's $20 in agriculture. That's a huge difference there. And so yes, maybe water markets are not going to spring up everywhere around the world, but if we have a way to make those sorts of deals with that kind of economic incentive and that kind of payoff in terms of the amount of efficiency improvements it takes to really solve a lot of these problems, I think, yes, the goal is to get something rolled out in appropriately in different parts of the world. And it'll have to be tailored to the context, that's for sure. But I think we're hopeful that we'll get there.
Yes, and I think also another aspect of this is just, a lot of foundations, a lot of donors use the word transformation. We want you to come to us with a transformative idea. The Rockefeller Foundation really means it. We all, we make the pitch in our proposals and we say, yes, this is a transformative idea, you should believe us. But the Rockefeller Foundation has continued to challenge us on that. And so every time we bring to our check-in meetings and bring in our idea and tell them what kind of progress we're making in its development, they would again remind us, and so where does this go? Where does this go from your couple of pilots, and how do you get it out and actually make a change in the broader world? So that's been an exciting part and a very challenging part. It really stretches our thinking.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for joining us here on the SIWI Sofa, and best of luck in further developing your parts of the Rockefeller Foundation program.
Thank you.
Eric.
Great, thank you.
And thanks for tuning in to the SIWI Sofa. Stay tuned for more episodes throughout the World Water Week.